She is. Hello.
Very, very good. Well, I'm going to mute people, if I may, just for the moment, and we'll begin. So I'd like to welcome everybody this evening. We are going to record this webinar so that a wider group of people can engage with this important subject. During the our speakers, when they're speaking to us, please do feel free to use the chat, and Richard will pick up questions or comments that come through on the chat. I'm going to ask Alex and Luke first, and then Alex to speak to us each for 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have a time for our questions and discussion following that. So that's the process. So I'd like to welcome Luke Piper and Alexandra Bulat, both from the 3Million organization. Luke is by background a solicitor and therefore a lawyer, and I might ask him just to say a few more words about himself when he begins. And Alexandra has just recently completed her PhD, looking at researching into attitudes in two of the most deprived areas of this country, attitudes to migrants and to immigration in Clacton and in Newham, two highly deprived areas, but both very distinctively different. And we'll ask Alex just to say a word perhaps about that in her introduction in a moment. So I think perhaps then, without further delay, Luke, could I ask you to speak to us and to introduce the subject?
Sure. Thank you, Guy, and thank you everybody for inviting us to speak today. So yeah, as Guy said, I'm a solicitor by training, but I'm head of policy at the 3Million, which is the largest campaign group in the UK representing the interest of EU citizens on the back of the UK's decision to exit from the European Union. Our attention is very much moulded and changed over the course of the years since we were founded back in 2016, but much of the work that we do now is about holding government to account and ensuring that they stick to their end of the bargain and the deal, specifically the withdrawal agreement. And much of our work at present is about looking at monitoring what is going on with the government's implementation of the withdrawal agreement, specifically to citizens' rights. So as you can probably imagine, all the drama of the past few weeks has been of pertinent interest to us, given what the government's apparent attitudes are towards the withdrawal agreement. So what I'm going to talk about is an overview to the issues and the sorts of problems that we've been seeing with the implementation of the withdrawal agreement for citizens' rights. What that means in reality, it's not just a legal construct, it has practical real-life implications for people's lives. And then Alex is going to talk about the kind of personal accounts really that she's come across, as well as through work that she's done herself, that circle around the sorts of themes and the problems that people have been having with enforcing their rights to stay in this country. And we'll also talk about the things that we are doing to try and make the situation better, and the campaign work that we're doing, and specifically what we need help with, and hopefully something that you and your colleagues will be able to provide support with. And we'll talk about that. That's the more juicy bits, I suppose. But as I said, to begin with, the issues around implementation. So as I said, the UK signed up to this withdrawal agreement, and the purpose of the withdrawal agreement in the context of citizens' rights is to protect the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. It has the effect of crystallising in a moment in time, rights of EU citizens and their family members. And there have been some changes and differences to how it's been codified into the withdrawal agreement. But what the UK has chosen to do is it has created a system by which people need to apply through to get their rights. So they don't just automatically get their rights at the end of this year. They have to go through an application process, and there is a deadline to that process, which is the end of June next year. So millions of EU citizens must apply for their new status to stay in the UK, and they need to put those applications in by the end of June. So it's a big thing. Now, the headlines are, you may have seen them, you may have seen the adverts that have been going around. The headlines are, the Home Office have had millions of applications to their scheme. It's called the EU Settlement Scheme. And millions of people have applied, millions of decisions have been made, people have been getting status, and it's in there, it's in the narrative, in the wider, media, whatever, is that it's a roaring success. Now, I will not deny that what the Home Office have achieved is not impressive. It is immensely impressive that they've managed to put millions of people through this process, especially when you take into consideration that this is the same organisation which is incompetent and has been shown to be incompetent at various stages throughout its long history, and that's regardless of colours of government that are at the helm. But it is not perfect by no stretch, and it is regrettable, but the government, despite its positive narrative, which we acknowledge, it is not prepared to engage with the substance of the problems of the scheme. Now, why is it so important? Why are we making a big deal out of it? Well, the reason is because of the consequences for those people that do not apply in time, and the consequences aren't necessarily being felt now because people have still got their EU law rights, but they will be felt if they don't apply in time. And those consequences are not necessarily the imagery of people being put in vans and being deported, and that very aggressive, angry, violent imagery that is often associated with migration control. I'm sure that will happen in some instances, but the vast majority of suffering that people will feel from not applying in time are the consequences of being made unlawfully resident in the United Kingdom. And that looks very similar, and the risk is that it looks very similar to the experiences of those people from the Windrush generation who found themselves in situations where they were unable to prove their lawful residence in the UK, so they weren't able to work, access help, they weren't able to get NHS treatment, they were, people were losing their homes, and it was awful, and that affected thousands of people. The situation is potentially, and this is not to belittle or undermine the awful tragedy and the terrible experience that thousands of people have felt, predominantly Black people have felt at the hands of the Windrush crisis. But the potential risk is that it could be worse for a cohort of thousands of EU citizens, because whereas the Windrush generation had a legal basis to be here, they just couldn't prove it. EU citizens will have no legal basis to be here, and they will have to navigate an application process to be able to prove their rights and apply late. So the consequences are potentially quite grave. And so the system, the EU settlement scheme, needs to be as perfect as it possibly can be to ensure that nobody is left behind and that people are able to enforce their rights and they don't feel the wrath of the what is commonly dubbed the hostile environment. So the series of measures of hostility towards migrants seeking that they remove themselves, be it through the form of, not being able to work and so forth. So much of our work has been focusing on these flaws, these cracks that will put people at risk of either not being able to get themselves through the EU settlement scheme and acquiring that really important status, or it has been through the issues with proving your status, much like how I was describing the Windrush generation. There is still this great anxiety about people's inability to prove their legal basis to be in the UK. So I'm going to talk through now briefly some of the headlines of those problems, those issues that could lead to the consequences that we're talking about, to try and bolster the current system and to make it better. And I will say this as a slight package on the side. Much of the things that I'm going to describe are practical, sensible, and crucially non-political. There is no political motivation behind what we suggest. It is purely out of the interest of making people's lives better and delivering on what was promised and ensuring that everything is done correctly. It is unfortunate that some of the attitudes that we are presented with, particularly by those in Parliament, are that we are some kind of political lobbying organisation. We are not. We are simply interested in ensuring that people get what they are entitled to in a fair and fact-driven way. So the core sorts of reasons of concern are, firstly, the risks to those who missed the deadline. And I won't talk into great detail about what sort of safety mechanics can be put in place, both legally and practically, to ensure that those that missed a deadline don't feel the brunt of the problem. And we long campaigned for a completely different legal way of people getting status through what's called a declaratory approach, which I won't go into too much detail about. But we've also been campaigning for a suite of legal mechanics, which would mean that if somebody misses the deadline, they have like a safety net that they fall into, and they can still get their status, but they won't feel that awful impact of the things that I was just describing before. And hopefully Alex will allude to some of the anxieties that people have been feeling on a personal level about that. So that's one of the first things. The second thing is issues relating to the proof of status. And this is where one of our main campaigns comes from that we're working on at the moment. Now, those that are successful in getting their new status through the EU settlement scheme will be granted a form of leave to remain. Now, ordinarily, under UK immigration law, you get a little plastic card, looks like a driver's license, it's got your picture on it, tells you what status you've got, you can get it out, you can show it to whomever you wish. But the government doesn't want to do that anymore, and it wants to do a digital-only approach. And the problem with that is that it makes a person's ability to prove their status entirely contingent on a system that is removed from them. A card is in your pocket, it's there. Some people, you might lose it, but at least that's your problem to fix. It's something that you own and it's something that you have control over. And a lot of physical document systems have digital backups. We have online banking nowadays. You've got your bank card. You can use your smartphone to pay for things. There is this multidisciplinary approach to proving things, navigating in the modern world, which often involves this dual approach of something that you can have in your hand as well as something that's in the cloud. The Home Office just want to do away with one and just stick with a new digital approach. So there is a lot of worry about this because there can be a series of events and a series of moments where just one thing fails in that system and that's it. You're locked out and you can't prove your status. Now, we've done quite a lot of research on this issue because it's quite heavily resisted to by the government, and we will talk later about the campaign that we're working on. And there's lots of other resources that we have about the sorts of arguments that we get presented to us by the government and how to counter those arguments. But in the large, it's a very sensible thing. And I'm reminded of a sort of comment that was made by one of the members in the House of Lords when this issue has been discussed before, which is that most people, when they go to an art gallery or they go somewhere, they'll have their membership card, and if they haven't got their membership card with them, they'll just type into the computer and they'll find them. It's that backup approach. If their computer system was down, you could have your physical card there with you, and it's that approach that we're calling on the government to adopt. Now, there are it's not just about this journey to acquiring the status. It's not just about getting the immigration status and the journey to that. And it's not just about proving status. It's also ensuring that people can enforce their rights. So it's not just about living legally in the UK. It's about being to enforce the bundle of rights that the withdrawal agreement gives you. The withdrawal agreement doesn't just give you the right to live in this country. It gives you the right to equal treatment. It gives you the right to work. And there is a level of fair play that's hardwired into EU law around EU citizens being treated as an equal to those in the host member state. And we are very keenly watching the way that the government employs and uses and introduces these equal treatment, what's called equal treatment provisions, into the law. And we're yet to see how it will go. But the warning signs are there. It's not looking good. And there are already disagreements, shall we say, of interpretation of the withdrawal agreement. This is probably sounding all very familiar now, but there have been differences of interpretation and opinion of the withdrawal agreement long before this problem with the Northern Irish Protocol emerged, but they've not really been talked about very much because they're sort of peripheral, and I think people are still sort of getting through the motions of trying to agree if it is a disagreement. But there are these divergences of thought that are coming around how people enforce their rights in the UK, and that's another thing that we're watching very carefully, and we'll see as it goes along. Now, I'll pass over to Alex now, but what I will say is that at the moment, a lot of people's experiences have been about these technical problems, nitty-gritty technical difficulties with navigating the system to get their status. And there are some other things as well, which hopefully Alex will talk about in detail. But that gives you an overview of where we are now. And I'll close by saying we are essentially guessing right now what the problems are going to be, but this guessing is not put your finger in an air and see which way the wind might blow. This is based on cold evidence of what we know to be the case and what will very likely be the case in less than a year's time, and now is the time to make those changes to put things right so that people are not left behind. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks very much indeed, Luke. That's absolutely fascinating. Those three areas that you've outlined there, and we'll certainly be coming back with some questions about those if we may. But Alex, turning to you, you've obviously, from what you said to me earlier, had some both personal experiences and engaged with quite a number of people who have also had the personal experiences. So we're very interested to hear what you've got to say to us.
Thanks both. So yes, as Luke mentioned, one of the issues around how the Home Office portrays the EU settlement scheme is it portrays it with big numbers without context. And that's what I want to do today, is put some context to my own personal experience as well as personal experiences of others that I listened to over the course of the last 3 years or so. So in the 3 Million, I lead on two projects. One is the Young Europeans Network. So I work a lot with young EU citizens, including publishing a report on young Europeans and their experiences of the settlement scheme, citizenship and political engagement in the UK. And more recently, I started managing a project on voting rights, democratic participation of EU citizens, because one of the areas which is still not done and dusted is actually local election voting rights. That's still under negotiation for EU citizens living in England and Northern Ireland. That's still not sorted out yet. So we're campaigning to maintain those voting rights in local elections as well. So yes, indeed, I did have experience with the Home Office. So I'll start perhaps with my own personal story and then moving on to detailing some of the reasons that are really concerning, including reasons for which people are not applying yet to the EU settlement scheme based on my own research and some other research from the sector. So my journey with the Home Office started after the referendum, when I realized that I need to do something to have some security about my status and have like at least a document showing that I'm lawfully in the country. So at that moment, I didn't have 5 years in the UK, so I couldn't have applied for a permanent residency card under EA legislation. And I rushed to apply for what is called a registration certificate, because I was really concerned that I don't have anything to prove that I am lawful in the country, and I need a document. It's a very interesting backstory to why I needed that registration certificate in the first place, is because my Romanian ID card, I'm from Romania originally, my ID card expired in 2015. You can't renew a Romanian ID card without a Romanian address. I don't own a flat or anything in Romania, a land. I couldn't renew the address there. And to renew the passport, you need a valid ID card. So I didn't have a valid ID card. I couldn't renew my ID card. Therefore, I couldn't renew my passport. And the only option to renew my Romanian passport was to do a Romanian passport with UK domicile, for which you need, guess what, a physical document from the Home Office. So I rushed to get this registration certificate as the only physical document I could get, proof from the Home Office that I was lawfully resident. One of the important things to mention is that those documents, those little blue cards, the registration certificate, that looks very similar to the permanent residency documentation. So a lot of people are confused about the difference between those two. Those will become invalid very soon. So people who have permanent residency card under EA regulations will have to exchange this for settled status unless they use it for citizenship. So I'll go in this about in a bit, because that's one of the reasons why some people I met haven't applied yet to the settlement scheme, because they thought, well, I've done my bit, I already have a document from the Home Office, I don't have to apply. So that's where my journey really started with the Home Office. That was a very easy thing to apply for. Like, I booked an appointment to the Home Office. I went to the very wonderful Lunar House in Croydon, and I got this registration certificate the same day. Of course, you have to pay extra to get it the same day. Now, after a year or so, I had 5 years in the UK, so I thought, well, I want to become British soon, so I will apply for a permanent residency documentation to get British, to become British later on based on that. Now, the Home Office rejected my permanent residency application, and that was because the evidence I submitted for comprehensive sickness insurance, that's something you need to have if you're a student or self-sufficient. You need to have comprehensive sickness insurance whilst you're in the UK to be lawfully in the UK, and they deemed the evidence I submitted as unsatisfactory in their view, and therefore they rejected my application for permanent residence. Because my application was rejected, and I had to wait for the settlement scheme because I couldn't produce more evidence, even more satisfactory evidence for the CSI. So I was actually part of the trial when they tested the EU settlement scheme before it was launched to the public in March 2019. Before that period, they tested the scheme first on some academics and some NHS staff, and then in a wider population, including other types of university staff. And I was working at UCL as a teaching assistant that time, so I was part of this trial. Now, what you hear from the Home Office is that, well, it's all quick and easy. It takes that time. It was really interesting. The Home Office was saying, they don't say this anymore, it takes 15 minutes to apply. So I thought, well, I'll do it before work. I had to commute to London at 9 a.m. or something. I took an hour before in the morning saying I have to, I can definitely do it. It takes 15 minutes, right? So I logged onto the system, I did everything, completed everything, and then you have to put your national insurance number. So they check your records, and if you have 5 years in your records, they will say you got settled status. If you don't have 5 years in your records, you have to submit additional evidence. And it returns, so it takes about a few seconds until they check their databases, and then the message popped out saying, we found no evidence of you, like, at all. So then I had to go back and have to download, find all those documents and upload everything. All went fine. It was very quick because I was in this trial period, so I got an answer the next day or so. But what I want to say about this process is I'm in a very, very privileged circumstance. So when I explained that all those different difficulties I had it in a context where I knew everything about my rights. I could read all the regulations that are, about my rights. I speak English fluently. I know how to operate digital systems. I know how to upload PDFs, to convert them, to kind of navigate all the system. And even with all these kind of things, I still didn't find it particularly straightforward. So the types of people that we are very concerned about are people who are not in this privileged situation that I was, that will, those different difficulties I had, that having to submit additional evidence, getting rejected for a certain form of immigration status and responding to that. This is something that I would deal in a different way with compared to a lot of people who don't have access to the same resources, language skills, and so on. I also took the next step. I applied for British citizenship, which again, I won't go into detail. It's something I campaign on as well within the 3 million. It's very inaccessible process for a lot of people, especially young people. So just to give you a short overview, you have to wait 12 months after you got your settlement scheme decision, unless you're married to a British citizen, in which case you can apply straight after you got your settled status, or married or in a civil partnership with a British citizen. And also I waited 12 months, and that's just to give you a summary of it. It cost £1,330, the application fee for British citizenship. In addition, you pay for other tests like English test, Life in the UK test, and so on. So overall, very complicated and complex process. So in the 3 million, that's not the topic of today, but we're also campaigning for a more accessible pathway to citizenship for EU citizens who choose to become British, because obviously it's a personal choice. But overall, what we're arguing in the 3 million is that people shouldn't feel they have to become British to feel safe in the UK. So we're campaigning on all those changes on the EU settlement scheme, because you should be able to feel safe in the country you call home with the settled status. And one of the reasons why I applied for British citizenship, amongst other reasons, is because I didn't feel particularly safe with settled status and how the government approached this and how this could change over time. And because I'm reading all this legal detail, I know how it could change as well. So, that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of EU citizens at the moment, we're seeing the number of applications for British citizenship increase as well, because a lot of people don't feel safe with the settlement scheme. And why they don't feel safe is partly about how the government approaches some of the issues that some of us in the sector, the 3 million and other migrant rights organizations, raise with the Home Office. Now, that's kind of like my personal story, but what is really concerning is the people who will be left behind. And that's something I find particularly difficult as a campaigner, that every time since the beginning of the settlement scheme, I said no matter how much outreach we do, there will be people who will be left behind. And I also have, alongside my work in the 3 million, I did, especially before COVID, a lot of outreach with Romanian migrant communities, and also did work as an immigration advisor specifically on the EU settlement scheme, and actually assisting one-to-one with applications. And a lot of my experience there, really, I knew before starting this outreach experience that not everyone will be reached, but every single day I went to do outreach, and we did things like, like Christmas market stalls, informing people about the EU settlement scheme, speaking to people one-to-one about this. I realized that it is an impossible task to reach everyone, especially with the underfunding we have in the sector in terms of outreach and legal support before the deadline. And it's something that the Home Office has necessarily engaged with. And overall, I have to say that no system in the entire world, let alone a similar system like the settlement scheme, has managed to reach 100% of people. So it's really important, those things, those legal safeguards that we're campaigning on, to have this safety net between the end of freedom of movement and the settlement scheme deadline are really important, because it's just, to be honest, I mean, wishful thinking to think that every single person will be reached on time before the deadline, because they won't. That's why we need the legal safety net. So just to end with, I would give a few reasons, because people may ask, and I am in a lot of difficult conversations with people who generally believe the EU settlement scheme is going great, and they ask me, so what are the reasons people are not applying? Because, you know, obviously this has been going on since March 2019. There are like there have been adverts, you know, Home Office has been posting on social media why people don't apply. You know, people should have known already. It's all over the TV and so on. So here are some reasons from some focus groups I have done with young people, with young EU migrants who live in London, primarily from Eastern European backgrounds and in low-paid work or students. So, and this is where it becomes really concerning, because we think about, this is one group, young people, young Europeans in London. We think about this group as, well, digitally literate, people with generally good level of English, who follow social media, who are likely to see those adverts, and still they are very misinformed about this topic. So if this group is very misinformed about this topic, let alone starting to think about groups who are really at risk, such as children in care, for example, there's very, very low application rates for children in care. There's a report by Quorum I could send if you're interested to read further, or people who are just digitally excluded, and other types of people with reduced mental capacity, for example. So there are a lot of different vulnerable groups. But here are just some reasons from those young Europeans focus groups. So the first reason that comes across in different conversations I have is people who have previous documentation from the Home Office and who think they don't have to apply when they do have to apply. One very good example is this permanent residency blue card, because some people have that and think, well, I've done my bit, I already gone through this application process with the Home Office, I have permanent residency, it says we are permanently resident in the UK, and they generally think they don't have to apply and they think their status will be valid. Well, that document will soon become invalid, so unless they will use it for a naturalization route to get British citizenship, they will have to exchange it for settled status. It's a bit easier, the application system, because the settlement scheme, they ask you, do you have permanent residency? And you say yes, and then it's a bit easier, don't have to submit all this additional evidence. Then there are people who have who came even earlier in the UK, who have indefinite leave to remain as a stamp in their passport, but they have left. So let's say I came in the 80s in the UK, I got indefinite leave to remain, and then I left. I lived back in Romania for 10 years, and I came back in the UK. If you live for longer than 2 years, your indefinite leave to remain lapses, so that won't be valid anymore as well. So there are people who have some form of documentation in the past, but they're not really sure, and it's quite unclear. In some situations, it's very complicated to know if that document is still valid or not. Those with indefinite leave to remain, with a valid indefinite leave to remain, that they don't necessarily have to apply for the EU settlement scheme, although there are some advantages they may wish to consider if they apply. So for instance, with settled status, you could live abroad for up to 5 years before the settled status lapses, whereas with indefinite leave to remain, it's 2. So that's kind of one of the categories of people. There are other types of documents. For Eastern Europeans, for example, there was this workers' registration scheme for A8 citizens. So I met quite a lot of Polish citizens who said, well, I registered the Home Office before in 2006 or 7, and they thought they don't have to do anything. So, well, this kind of previous documents. Then there's just simple misinformation. So I came across people, honestly, who think, well, I'm a student, I don't have to apply because I have student status. I mean, it sounds ridiculous perhaps, but that's generally what some people think. I got people in those outreach sessions who said, well, the settlement scheme is for people who are on benefits. I'm in work, I pay my taxes, why on earth should I apply? I've been working here for 20 years and contributing. So it's kind of just people who are misinformed, either because they didn't, the correct information doesn't reach them, or because genuinely they were through word of mouth or other people in their community, they got the wrong information and they won't research it further and just they don't have the correct information. Then there's very interesting discussions around just the name of EU settlement scheme. So for a lot of young people in these focus groups, they thought, well, this is for people who want to stay permanently in the UK. And they said, well, I'm only here for a few years. I may want to, go somewhere else, work somewhere else, study somewhere else. I don't feel settled. Why should I have to apply to become settled? And I didn't realize that's a must. As Luke said, you must apply. It's not have something to choose to only if you feel necessarily settled in the UK. Then there are also I come across a lot of different technical difficulties, especially now in the times of COVID. People without valid ID. We may think, this is a very niche issue, but actually a lot of people have expired documents and they find it particularly difficult now in the times of COVID to renew their documents and to be able to apply to the EU settlement scheme. There are some ways you could apply without a valid ID, but it involves an immigration advisor and it's very difficult to do so, and people may not necessarily know about this, and you have to prove that you took all steps necessary to apply to get your ID in the first place. And then there's more the emotional aspect, and I'll end on this. I met, and this is quite concerning as well, because it's a minority of people, but I meet people who just say, well, I won't apply because I disagree with it, or because they feel they shouldn't apply in the country they called home for 30 or 40 years. And those are very difficult conversations, especially when I was doing outreach as an advisor on this, because I need to persuade people why it's a must actually lose their rights if they don't apply for this on time. So it's overall, every single day I do outreach on this now on social media. It's very concerning. Just recently I received, just earlier this morning, another message from an EU citizen saying, I haven't received any reply from the Home Office on my settlement scheme. And I asked, can you send me a screenshot, or can you send me some further details? And they actually realized they only did the ID check. They didn't complete their application, and they thought only doing the ID check was the application. And I only realized this after investigating and asking questions. So it's very concerning. It confuses a lot of people, and there's still a lot of misinformation on this topic. And I think, one of the things that, before I pass on to Luke to explain what can we do on physical documents issue, one thing that I would like the government to do is actually have better communication on this issue. Underline that non-EU family members of EU citizens can apply to the EU settlement scheme as well, because some non-EU family members I met don't feel they're included in this because it's called the EU settlement scheme. Then really have very clear communication that's something that you must apply for. It's not like a choice or something that you feel like doing, and overall have more support in place, including through voluntary organizations who have provide free legal advice on this, especially as we approach the deadline, to make sure that the most vulnerable and risk groups are reached on time. So I'll just pass to Luke now to explain a bit about what can everyone do on the physical documents issue as well.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm going to just let people ask a few questions, and then we'll come back to you, Luke, and on what can we do, as it were, towards the end, because that's very important. But thank you, Alex, very much. That's I can understand from your perspective, but also from what Luke was saying earlier, these quite painful situations that people find themselves in, and you wanting to resolve, but quite a lot of things are not able to be resolved at the present time. Could I just ask first one question, and then we'll come to Harriet, who's got a question on chat. Let's since we're a limited number of people, let's unmute, and if people want to ask questions, perhaps just stick a hand up, something like that may work just as well. Just to ask Luke and Alex, if you wish to, what kind of support and active involvement in all of this is coming from the European institutions? I mean, here you are as a voluntary sector organization working away with people and advocating for change with the Home Office and government and so on. But are you being significantly and proactively supported in other ways by the institutions?
well, firstly, politically, they are very keen to understand what's going on. We have regular meetings with the European Commission. They have their own eyes and ears on the ground in the UK, monitoring what's going on, and they've got quite a competent team. The European Parliament, obviously very interested what's going on and listening, and will put pressure and raise questions where relevant and so forth. But in terms of support for people to get through this journey and navigating the problems that Alex was talking about, doesn't exist. And the reason why it doesn't exist is because the UK isn't a member of the EU anymore. It's their responsibility to uphold and implement their end of the deal. And the UK government, via the Foreign Commonwealth Office, makes a lot of noise about how the Commission isn't perhaps doing an amazing job for Brits in the EU. But they face a very different problem to what EU citizens do. But I would say we get listened to. The issues that we raise get acknowledged. Does it shape or change things that are going on? Who can say? But yeah, it's interesting.
But there isn't, even if it seems to be a name only, as in the withdrawal agreement, there isn't a joint committee, as it were, into which specific issues of the kinds that you're raising can be sort of placed and know that they're on an agenda within some kind of joint officials meeting.
There is a joint committee. There is a overarching one, and then there's specialist committees that exist within the joint committee, and one of those is exclusively for citizens' rights. So Monique and I have spoken to that committee before, and it's one of the forums in which we are able to raise grievances and concerns. But the conversations and discussions that happen in that setting are confidential. So we don't know what gets discussed and what the outcomes are. We only get, snippets and scraps. And the UK government is very free to tell us what they tell the EU is wrong, but they don't tell us what the EU tells them that is wrong. Beyond saying, but I'm trying to remember how they phrased it last time, but the beyond saying how well the UK is doing, or something. It was some interesting line that we got. But as I say, there is a legal forum where these issues are discussed and fleshed out. It's not the same as a
face-to-face
kind of infrastructure that the government is, the light touch infrastructure that the government has in place to support people to achieve the end that they need to achieve.
Thank you. Harriet, would you like just to, you put a question up on the chat, would you like to sort of speak to that?
Oh, yes, okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, the thing is, my husband is Italian, I'm British. We lived in Italy until 2016. Then we moved back. But my daughter is in Italy and my family is in Germany. My husband has applied and received pre-settled status, but we can't apply for settled status for him until September, October, because that's when the 5 years elapse. When you said June is a deadline, that worried me a little bit, because should he apply early before June for the settled status, or does he just wait until the 5 years elapse?
If I'll answer this quickly for you, Harry, I was being very shorthand in my summary. I think it was more so that people need, if they're not already in the scheme, they need to apply into it. Now, if your husband is already there, he's obviously fine, he's got his status, but when he's eligible to apply for settled status, then obviously he can do that. He doesn't need to necessarily worry about the pending deadline.
But at the moment, he's worried about, he doesn't dare visit Italy or Germany or leave the UK in case in case the government don't allow him back in again. Should he be worried about that with pre-settled status? Do you think?
You worried about what? Sorry, Harriet, I didn't quite catch that.
Worried about not being allowed back into the UK because the 5 years haven't elapsed. If we go to visit my daughter in Italy, for example.
Well, if he's got his pre-settled status, then he will be allowed back into the UK. There are some absence rules relating to eligibility for settled status, but if you're just popping out for little visits to see your family and things like that, you should be okay. And also, I think what you said, you'd be eligible in September next year, so it's not that far off. I think based on what you're sort of saying, it's all right. But I think it's interesting, because it doesn't take much for people's confidence to get knocked about this process, which is one thing I've always found quite striking.
Thanks.
Monique, yes.
Yeah, I just want, because really what you're highlighting also is another issue that we are sort of working on, which is that like your husband, he can reapply and get full settled status next year, like you say. But if he doesn't, if he forgets to do that, his pre-settled status is only valid for a period total of 5 years. And after that, it expires and you'd be without status. So that is just highlighting another one of the things that are not quite right about the scheme, is that there are sort of millions of individual little cliff edges for people on very different dates, because it's 5 years after they were granted pre-settled status. And I think it's very, very easy to don't forget that you have to convert it at some point in the future.
No automatic reminders then?
Well, I think they are going to send out reminders, aren't they, Luke? They have conceded that, and they mentioned that again in the debate.
We won't.
If people change their address or don't maintain it or have a different email address, things can get lost. It's not foolproof, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it relates to the other issue that, we're mentioning, that getting settled status is not the end of the process. Then you just start this relationship with the Home Office, and you have to update the Home Office every time you change your address, your phone number, every time you renew your passport, for example. So if the Home Office were going to send reminders, let's say by text, and you change your phone number meanwhile, and you haven't logged in the online system to update your settled status or pre-settled status details, then you wouldn't receive those communications. So yes, it's one of the other things that I find it quite difficult to explain to, especially the communities I work with when I did outreach with Romanian citizens who had limited digital skills and language knowledge, to just explain how to update your settlement scheme details online, and how every time you change something in your life, you basically have to log in the system and update it again. And I think that's something that will cause issues in the future, because if you change your passport and you have a different passport number and you don't know, or you don't, you have to update, or don't manage to update it, then your status won't be linked to the document that you're using, and it could create massive issues as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions? I've got some, but Penny or Janet or Richard.
I have one question, or perhaps two questions. Alexandra mentioned the question of funding. Is your funding entirely from contributions from individuals? Or is there any public money that you're able to draw on?
For outreach, so the 3 Million is not an OISC accredited organization. So for an organization to be able to give legal advice, you need to be registered to the OIC. So we're not giving legal advice to individuals. I did this outreach kind of work in another organization, in a charity that does provide legal advice, and that is OISC accredited. So there's a number of charities across the UK that receive money from the Home Office. So if I think there's available online, it's a list list of, I'm not sure, it's 57, is it, Luke, of charities which are funded, have projects funded by the Home Office specifically to reach vulnerable at-risk EU citizens. But overall, in the context of COVID, I have to say this work has been severely limited because we're not able to go out in communities anymore to reach people face to face. And for example, before, I'm not doing this type of work anymore, but when I was still doing it at the beginning of the summer, we did it everything digitally. So we did information sessions on Facebook Live, for example, or responding to people via text. And, you know, to be honest, the people who are most at risk need a person, an advisor, to be face to face, to go through their documents and to do the application in person. So it's not, you can't do everything online, especially when the restrictions were up. So yes, in terms of the 3 million, we don't do that type of work. We're raising the issues and lobbying on the issues, but we're not providing legal advice.
But to kind of add to that, Richard, I mean, the work that we do is, you know, analysing, putting out, you know, briefings, pressure on the government, and where necessary, bringing legal challenges in the courts to sue the government if they don't do what they're supposed to do. Much of that work that we do is funded by donations from the public and funded from philanthropic charitable trusts, mainly Quaker sort of origined, you know, organisations, as you would probably expect, like Joseph Rowntree and things like that. And it's what is quite striking, particularly about the work that we do, how alone we are in the way that we do it. A lot of organisations are linked with the kind of work that Alex was just describing there, going out there, helping people, forms, blah, 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 blah. But there's not many people who do the kind of political work that we do. We are unique in that respect. So there's quite a lot of pressure on us to do it right.
And how many of you are there? How many volunteers doing the sort of work you're doing?
Well, I'm thankfully through a couple of philanthropic trusts that we've applied to, they're going to pay for me to work full time for the 3 million from next month, which is great. So I'm going to stop for a couple of years and just focus on this. And Alex, she gets funded for specific projects as well. But Monique is entirely a volunteer. She might as well be an employee. She's that dedicated. So, you know, there are other people as well who volunteer their time, you know, and it varies. On the campaign that I'm going to briefly speak about in a moment, you know, I think there's 5 or 8 people who are involved who just volunteering their time because, you know, they believe passionately about these issues, and yeah, it's amazing, really.
It's so important, I must say. Let's just have a couple more questions, and then we'll come back to you, Luke and Alexandra, maybe Monique, just about ways in which we might be able to help. Janet, did you have something you wanted to raise?
Not really. I mean, I was just wondering, is there any idea of the numbers involved, those who are at risk?
Alex, what do you think about that?
I think there have been various estimates. I think there are good reports, but I would recommend going to the Migration Observatory website at the University of Oxford. They have a report called Unsettled Status, and they estimate the types of groups at risk. So I think they are estimating around 10% of the EU migrant population in the UK would be under one of those groups at risk of not applying for the EU settlement scheme. But I think the issue is even deeper than that. The issue is that in the UK, there was no registration process. Like if you go to other EU countries, when you come in to work to some EU countries, you register at the local level. So actually everything that we're basing our assumptions on are population estimates. They're not accurate. And if we look at the EU settlement scheme statistics, in some areas, they even estimate that more than 100% applied. So what the population estimates that are working on are really underestimates, and this creates the issue because we won't be sure after the deadline passes, we won't be sure how many people are left to apply just because we don't have accurate numbers. I'm not sure if you want look to add to that, but that's something that's really, really concerning that we don't have accurate numbers on that.
Yeah, I think the central kind of it's a very Home Office thing to say that. Sorry, excuse all the banging around. It's a very Home Office thing to say is all these millions of people have applied, but just not make any reference to the measure. So it could be 1 million of 10, it could be 4 million of 10 for all I bloody know. It's that kind of thing. But I think what's quite telling for me anyway is that I think most people were expecting the kind of numbers that have applied now to be the number next year. So we were expecting to kind of hit these numbers next year, June sort of time, but we're now meeting them now. So either people are very overly enthusiastic, or the estimates are way off. And I suspect that it's the latter, that they really don't have a clue. And one of my favourite statistics a few months ago, but based on the estimates of Bulgarian nationals living in the UK, I think it was 135% of Bulgarians had applied. So
yeah, that was months ago as well. So I think now it's like 170% or something like that.
Yeah.
Could I just go back to one question? You were speaking about when the deadline has passed. One of your areas was the sort of question.
You've gone, Guy, a little bit. Phased out a bit.
Can you hear me now?
Frozen for me.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Oh, he's back. Go and ask again, Guy.
Am I there? Good. It's a double question here. You were speaking about how cases. No, have I gone again? Oh, bother. Hang on 1 second.
It's not working for you today.
Hang on.
Write it in the chat, Guy.
Wait a minute. Is that any better? Nope.